This workshop recording captures what happened in the main Zoom room for each session. What appears in chat or breakout rooms is not captured in the recording. Each participant and viewer comes to the session with a unique lived experience. Anyone may experience unintentional harm from the viewed content or transcript. Please feel free to pause the recording at any time, to walk away from it, or to take time for self-care or processing. When difficult moments occur during a session, further discussion may happen in debriefs or external communications to attempt to repair and care for those involved. What's included in the recording may not represent that additional work. If you feel impacted or harmed by what you experience, please seek out support from your campus or community resources to care for yourself however you need.
All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining. If you were not at the keynote, my name is Dr. Kate Everts, and in addition to being a licensed clinical psychologist, I work at the PsyD program at the New England campus as both Director of Student Affairs and Director of the Center for Diversity and Social Justice, which is how I came to know Melissa Kennedy, Dr. Kennedy, and Dr. Bergkamp. We've been collaborating now for several years, and I've really had the pleasure of seeing the incredible work they do with their students in their DISPI lab. And I really am excited to share with you all that they will be presenting today about the aggregate model. They've been teaching this model now for about a decade, actually, in the program in Seattle, the PsyD program in Seattle, and it's had different sort of iterations and growth moments. And so this is an exciting chance to hear about the latest growth moments, if you will. The model explores for the clinician and client 3 different levels: the Chronos, social location, and individual level, as we'll hear about. And then doctoral students will also be sharing their own case examples as ways of exemplifying the model. And there's also opportunity for interaction, which is a lovely way of decolonizing the presentation as well. So thank you so much to Dr. Kennedy and Dr. Bergkamp and everybody for presenting, and I'll pass it on to Dr. Kennedy.
Well, thank you, Kate, for that lovely introduction. It's great to be here working with you in this way. We're very excited. We want to bring some joy into our presentation following Dr. Bryant's inspiring words this morning. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. I'm going to be the point person for slides. So if things don't advance properly, that will be on me. So we'll be working with this. So we're coming this morning and we'll do some quick introductions, but I'd like to let you all know, as Dr. Everts mentioned, that we're here from the Decolonial and Social Privilege Awareness Initiative. This is our lab at the Antioch University Seattle campus. And in our lab, we have several important pillars and foundations of what we do. But basically, our decolonial work is around decolonizing the colonial mindset and dispersing with as much disconsciousness and the weight of the burden of coloniality as we can. And the social privilege awareness is a second piece or an integral piece of the lab. And this is really about recognizing our privilege. And to that end, we all grapple and face so many things about our privilege in this work. And we find that recognition of that social privilege makes so many other things possible. And without the self-awareness that we seek to foster in our students and in ourselves, we lack some very necessary pieces of this work. So it's a very important component. I am core faculty at the Antioch University Seattle campus in our PsyD program. As you can tell, I'm a white, middle-aged woman. I'm cisgendered, heterosexual female. I'm a citizen of the United States. I have no indigenous heritage. I was raised in a Christian environment, and I'm an able-bodied woman. So just to give a little bit of background, I'm going to now let us each introduce ourselves, and then we'll move on into the presentation. Jude, do you want to go?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for taking the time to come after that. We're sort of in the afterglow of the opening, I think. So my name is Jude Bergkamp. My status or my roles include being a core faculty and chair of the PsyD program at Antioch in Seattle. My ranks, or things about my identity domain that in a way history and coloniality have kind of conferred privilege upon me. If we're familiar with the addressing model, I have pretty much privilege all the way down the line as far as my identity domains that Melissa kind of spoke about. I think the only one is that I'm biracial. My mom is from India. My father's a white farm boy from Kansas. And so I spent my childhood moving in those two realms or domains. And I think that straddling those two worlds, but not quite belonging to either one, initiated sort of a fire of confusion and curiosity in me that brought me here to psychology. So now I think I'll hand it back to Melissa.
Sure. Thanks, Jude. We have the sheer delight in having two of our excellent students with us presenting today, and they will each give a case presentation as we move through our time with you all. And doing the first case presentation will be Kelly Rapp. Kelly, do you want to do a quick interjection?
Yes, my name is Kelly Rapp. I use she, her pronouns. Regarding my social location, I am a 32-year-old white cisgender woman. I'm temporarily able-bodied. I'm a U.S. citizen with no Indigenous heritage. And I'm also a second-year PsyD student at the Antioch University in Seattle.
And Miana?
Hello, my name is Miana Trainor. I also use she, her pronouns. I'm a second-year doctoral student at Antioch, Seattle. My social location is a 25-year-old bisexual cisgender woman. I have U.S. citizenship and non-Indigenous heritage. I am upper middle class and Catholic and have an acquired mental health disability with no developmental or physical disabilities. I am biracial, Asian and white, and have Hong Kong, Irish, and German ethnicities.
Oh, thank you very much. All right, we're going to go ahead and jump in. And Jude's, this is a quick overview. We're going to give an introduction to our model that we work with, the aggregate model. Then we'll move into our case studies, and we'll conclude with some expectations and considerations that we offer to all of you in thinking about this model. So we'll jump right in, and I'm going to turn it over to Jude.
Great. All right. Thanks, Melissa. So I think this model, let me see how I can start to say, well, first, when we look at the model framework, number one, like I mentioned previously, I think I came to psychology as a calling, maybe a little of a neurotic calling to try to figure out what my identity was all about, moving from these two worlds of India and rural Kansas, where I would do the rodeo one day and then go and do puja the next. So I think I came to psychology with this hunger to figure things out. And psychology did have some really powerful tools for me to understand what was going on, some of the best that I could find anywhere. As I continued in my clinical training in the field, I became more and more dissatisfied, bumping up against walls of what I considered sort of limitations or a lack of imagination as far as how we think clinically, especially in case conceptualization. So one of the things that that I think, yeah, Melissa, you can, I'll do this to do that. There you go. So a couple of things that I think are the inspiration for this model that has been developed probably over the last 15 years. I started to piece it together, but it's definitely not mine, as the spirit of the model will kind of show. It is a culmination of the wisdom and ideas of so many people, including the three others that are here with me today. So one, it's this model is a move to try to move beyond individual pathology. I think that the colonial nature of clinical psychology seems to place pathology within the bubble or confines of the individual. And that in itself could perpetrate a type of colonial harm, despite our best intentions. Next. We want to revision what is the etiology of human suffering. Is it our own faulty habits of the mind and of thoughts? Is it our own emotional dysregulation? Is it our own kind of thinking errors? Or could there be more? And could there even be more than just the etiology of suffering that was caused by our parents, or maybe by a trauma, an event, a specific event? Could it be more? So this model also challenges all of us to move beyond cultural competency to what's now being called structural competency. This idea that we're not just moving about as far as what are our cultural or heritage sort of aspects, but actually what is influencing and shaping each of us as individuals. Could it also be institutions? Could it be systems? And could it be this colonial historic ground that we all share? So what I want to do, we want to try to push everyone here today just to think about, even as a cognitive exercise, is this model hopes to kind of call out the colonial ghost that's manifesting in our daily lives. Dr. Kennedy, Melissa mentioned this thing about a colonial mindset. That's the idea that coloniality and the ideas that came from history actually embody our bodies and our minds right now, today. And so we want to account for the gravity of history in our clinical conceptualizations. So this model is, one, a reflective tool for case conceptualization. The other is it's a model that hopefully will increase clinicians' awareness of themselves as the tool of healing, as the tool of therapy, because the only consistent thing that we have in clinical work is ourselves as the therapist. And so what we want to do is, instead of cultivate kind of a clinical competency that constantly focuses on the other, this model is calling us to really think about ourselves, our own positionality, our own historical influences, and how that then compares with the client. The word aggregate came from my own kind of Buddhist practice and study, and it's out of this concept of interdependent arising, which ultimately means that everything is interdependent. Nothing exists in and of itself. So me, little Jude right here, where is Jude? How do you find it? There's no Jude solidified, right? Jude changes and moves and evolves depending on the interdependent relationships with my world and with my life. In Buddhism also, the biggest kind of interdependent piece is this idea of the self, of Jude. And actually in Buddhism, it really kind of talks about, could our clinging and holding on so tight, our attachment to the self as Jude, let's say, could be the core etiology of suffering. Good. Okay, great. So here's a depiction of our model. We've got basically three different stratum: the chronostratum, social location, and the individual stratum. Right? So I talked a little bit about inspiration. We can keep clicking. Right? Yep. You can keep going, Melissa. Maybe even to the next one.
Next slide.
Yeah. There we go. So again, like I mentioned before, this model is really to look at the clinician first and then apply it to our clients. One of the pieces that I think Melissa will talk about a little bit later at the end of these two great case studies we've got is this risk of feeling like we're stereotyping or making assumptions of our client. So when we think about this model, basically we're kind of trying to carefully cautiously and explicitly assume what could be the historical influences that are kind of the gravity and weight that has on our client. There might be parts of our client's social location, i.e. the addressing model as we kind of depicted in our introductions, but there could be some of those that are invisible and not seen. And even if we see them, we might be making assumptions and exercising stereotypes. The thing is, based on the really robust research we have on implicit bias and colorblind ideology, that research says we're already doing that. We're already implicitly doing that automatically. We are almost socialized to a barcode categorization of each other. So what that research says is, why don't we carefully, explicitly own what our assumptions are? And then as the therapeutic kind of relationship and alliance grows, we continue to check out what those assumptions are, either accurate or not. All right, next. Woo, okay, great. So basically, again, we have these three stratum: chronos, social location, and individual. I'll basically identify and kind of define as best I can and as quickly as I can the definitions of each of these. But what's important is just to show that these are sort of hierarchical in nature, meaning that history defines and influences how we define who we are, and how, most importantly, how society and structures and institutions define who we are, our access, our resources, our worth. And then finally, this final one, the individual, which is our own unique story, the story of who Jude is and how Jude came to be. But we can't fully know who Jude is or how he came to be without understanding the social location and the gravity and colonial influences that have defined it. All right, next. So chronos, this is one of, I think, the most, I don't know how to put this, elusive kind of stratum. We don't usually talk about history. Usually in psychology, the focus being on the individual, it's very difficult to connect with what historical forces have sort of shaped us. But chronos includes ideas about philosophical assumptions, political movements, governmental structures, institutional law, and policy. That our identity, all of these different identity domains and categories, they have their social meanings are actually somewhat unstable and historically contingent due to kind of constant evolution. So that might be the way that I see and understand myself as a man may be very different than the way that my father understands himself as a man, and how that's changed over time. A lot of times, and this would include race, how my father as a white man understands himself, and myself as a brown man now understanding myself now, it's changed over time. Now, in the here and now, it can feel kind of like it's stuck and we're stuck in things. But this aggregate model encourages us to see how historical influences have shifted and moved things, even if it was at a glacial pace, if you will. All right, next. So one of, I think, the most powerful examples in my mind that probably all of us here share is the chronos element of the melting pot. This is a foundational belief in our country. I won't get into this example too much, but basically the melting pot as a term came about really in around 1905, 1909. This was a play that came to Washington, D.C., and actually Theodore Roosevelt, who is sort of the engineer of so many of our social policies, said that this play shaped his thinking about the direction of America. And if you take a look, you see all of these sort of folks from all over the world swirling around the Statue of Liberty, and then in somehow a very patriotic, good-feeling thing, they all drop into a flaming cauldron of sameness, of Americanness. All right, next. So to put this into context, and really, if we think about it, this was only maybe 2 or 3 generations ago. So we can think about it in the past, but actually how much of this intergenerational transmission has passed on this melting pot assumption to all of us. And so Henry Ford, as most of us know as the car guy, one of the most successful early American companies, didn't just see himself as an automobile sort of innovator. He also saw himself as somewhat of a social engineer. And so in this idea of the melting pot, basically they would recruit folks right off the boat as they immigrated in to Ellis Island. They would recruit them to come work at Ford. The contract which they signed was for the Ford English School. The conditions of this contract was that in 2 years they had to commit to speaking English. But there was also other provisions in this contract that were interesting to note. One of them is that all the money they made here in America could not be sent back home, that they could not speak their home language and tongue at their American home. And in their American home, they actually needed to limit the kind of relics and pictures and stories and music and food from where they were back home. In other words, a way to make these folks, quote unquote, American. Now, who dictates what that means is another question. So at the graduation ceremony of the Ford English School, you actually literally had a giant melting pot. And if you can see in this picture, you might see stairs hopefully going up into the melting pot and then out of the melting pot. And so the ritual here was that folks would be given their clothes upon which they had been hired for Ford. So their clothes that they came to America with were taken and kept. And at the graduation ceremony, they wore those clothes. Melissa, could you go back one real quick?
Sure.
Thank you. So they wore those clothes in which they came to this country with, and they walked up the stairs, walked down into the melting pot, and disappeared. In there, they took off those old clothes and put on a standard issued outfit from Ford. They were given an American flag, and then they walked up the stairs, emerging as truly American. Okay, next. So here's just another picture of one of these many graduation ceremonies. The point here is that the melting pot could be a core kind of historical philosophy that has been ingrained into all of us. And this model challenges us to explicitly extract what that is and cognitively, consciously explore then how has that influenced my life, the way that I define my social location, the way that I define who I am as a person. All right, next. Oh, there we go. So here it is again. Remember, Chronos is that kind of historical gravity that's really, I think, colonial in nature. Good. So the next one is what we call the social location strata. So these are what we call ranks that usually are assigned at birth, usually by the lottery of birth, and that these basically have what we call socially conferred privilege or the lack thereof. So in our introductions, we went ahead and talked about our ranks. And for me, most of my ranks have privilege. That privilege didn't come from nowhere. That privilege isn't just kind of a social contract that exists in the here and now. That privilege isn't just something that kind of that is a set of assumptions and exercised by prejudice or discrimination at an interpersonal level. No, that privilege is socially conferred. That privilege was developed and maintained and reinforced over time, baked in, if you will, to our systems and institutions. And so how we see ourselves versus how others, specifically society and the systems and institutions, see us and categorize us, that is always a very crunchy, conflictual place. But the point here is that history, that chronos stratum, really has the power to define how we all see our social location. Great, next. So finally, the final stratum is the individual stratum. This is our idiographic and unique story of who I am in my life. This is what I propose is the dominant discourse of clinical psychology. When we listen to therapy, when we talk about therapy, mostly what we're talking about is this individual stratum. And we hardly kind of break the ceiling out of that stratum and go into social location. And then we almost never break that one and go into truly historic chronos sorts of considerations. And so here, while we're not discounting the individual stratum and how important our personal journey is, the challenge that this model poses to us is to see that journey within the context of socially conferred privilege and oppression and the shared colonial ground that defines that. So clinical issues such as mental illness and trauma can be included in this stratum. And yet, even if we think about this idea of trauma, is trauma in a way, what would we say, kind of the same across the board? Or could our experience of trauma be distinct and different based on our social location? Could it be that if we have more ranks that are what we call target ranks, or places where we don't have privilege and have been marginalized and are the targets of oppression, could that somehow change the quality of the trauma? And then how has those social locations been defined and changed depending on our historical context? And so all of these different stratum, hopefully, as you can see with these case studies, will help to show that each of these stratum are very important to consider in clinical work. The difficulty is when we use this model, we are breaking some implicit rules of psychology. And so this is, so just kind of as you listen to these next two case studies, notice internally, is there any tension or reactions that you have when we start to move above the individual stratum to social location and history and chronos? Okay, with that, great. Okay, you can click one more, I think, and I will now hand it over to Kelly.
Thanks, Dr. Bergkamp. So just wanted to give everyone an idea of what I'm going to run through in this case study. First, I'm going to talk about how Mark presented kind of this traditional case presentation, talk about his signs and symptoms. Then we'll walk through Mark's aggregate model strata, like Dr. Bergkamp just did, and we'll talk about how those change or influence my views of his signs and symptoms. Then we'll compare Mark's and my strata and kind of take that opportunity to take a step back and address some positionality that I have and what I'm bringing into the room. And then we'll finish with comparing the traditional case conceptualization I created for Mark with the new case conceptualization that I created via the aggregate model. So with that, the traditional case presentation, Mark is a 35-year-old man. He is seeking personal therapy at his wife's request to increase his communication skills and emotional responsiveness, as well as learn better means to support his wife's emotional needs. The signs and symptoms he presented with were some conflict avoidance, poor communication skills, lack of emotional availability and understanding, low discomfort tolerance, and mild anxious feelings. When Mark first presented to me, I saw him as like articulate, somewhat no nonsense. He seemed to emphasize logic above all else, like really wanted to stay out of his emotions. He used a lot of clinical jargon, like kind of made me think like Brene Brown, like he's talking about emotional intelligence and attachment styles and things like that. We also talked a lot about how he could help his partner with her emotions and how to avoid conflict with her. And generally, he was just very hesitant to examine his own emotions or why conflict might be okay in some circumstances, like to the benefit of the relationship. So, with that in mind, looking at Mark's individual stratum in the aggregate model, he is married, middle class. He has a GED diploma. He works at his family-owned business, and he currently has stable housing, and his wife is a psychiatrist. So when I'm looking at this, the things that kind of particularly stick out to me when I'm considering his signs and symptoms is first his GED diploma. And this especially gives me pause or makes me think twice about it because his wife is a psychiatrist. And so I'm noticing this large discrepancy between his education level and her education level. So how might that play out in the dynamics with his wife? Is this where maybe some of those poor communication skills come in? Maybe he feels like he can't speak to her level, so why try? Maybe some of that conflict avoidance. Those are some things that are just going through my head. The other thing that sticks out to me is some of the impacts of working at his family-owned business. Maybe there's some social isolation. He's just always with a particular group of people. Not there's anything wrong with spending a large amount of time with family, but maybe he's just not like kind of branching out into different social areas. Maybe he's stuck in a lot of family dynamics, and that's some of those poor communication skills or conflict avoidance. And maybe also some low discomfort tolerance. If he's just so comfortable with these people, then when he kind of gets outside of that, he doesn't know how to handle some of those feelings of discomfort. The other thing, circling back to his wife being a psychiatrist, he's surrounded by this language of therapy constantly. So he's using a lot of this jargon, but doesn't really know what it means, or he's kind of using it maybe in inappropriate situations, something like that. And again, I'm thinking, how does this impact his ability to address concerns with his wife? Slide, please. So regarding Mark's social location, he's a 35-year-old, temporarily able-bodied, raised Christian. He's middle class, heterosexual, no indigenous heritage. He's a U.S. citizen, and he is a cisgender man. So kind of like Dr. Bergkamp alluded to, Mark, for all intents and purposes, is a super agent, that he has agent rank in all of his social locations, or the social locations that I'm aware of based on our discussions. And so what that is making me think is, he probably hasn't experienced a lot of societally based adversity or oppression. And so I'm immediately thinking of this low discomfort tolerance, that he has never really had to maybe grapple with some of these things. I'm just kind of thinking that he's maybe able to like float along above all of this fray that is going on for people who have target ranks. Again, maybe that's some of that conflict avoidance too, the poor communication skills. You've ever had kind of discuss difficult topics like that, you're not going to develop those skills. The other thing that I'm considering is the fact that he's a U.S. citizen and what that means for him. Specifically the fact that he has been raised and habituated in the U.S. culture and American culture, the westernized culture of individualistic, hypermasculine, white society. And I'm looking again at his lack of emotional availability and understanding, that he has just been socialized in a lot of ways to be that way. And I recognize there's a lot of other areas to his social location that maybe we're not discussing, but these are just the first couple things that are sticking out to me considering his signs and symptoms. Slide, please. So for his stratum of Chronos, I talked about colonialization, imperialism, white supremacy, and the patriarchal history in the US. And these specifically, I think, do have a large impact on Mark's presentation. Again, talking about that indoctrination into hyper-individualism, independence, and toxic masculinity that is just steeped in American culture. It goes back hundreds of years, and that comes back to this idea of lack of emotional availability, his understanding of himself, and his comfortability with examining his emotions and expressing his emotions. And and maybe some of the struggle to be in community with others or in relationship with others, specifically with his wife. The other thing I'm looking at here is the economic uncertainty of the early 2000s that I have listed. I'm considering maybe this is his reason that he didn't attend college or he didn't go to a technical school or something like that. And like Dr. Bergkamp mentioned, this is an assumption that I have, and it's something that I want to address further with Mark. But saying it out loud here doesn't mean that not saying it or talking about it in the session with Mark means that it wouldn't come up or that it wouldn't still be there. So I just want to highlight it's an assumption, something that I want to address with him and discuss further. But I'm thinking if Mark graduated high school with the plan to attend community college or four-year college, but due to the economic uncertainty of the early 2000s, financially, he wasn't able to do that. Maybe that's making him feel inferior to others. Maybe that's why he's holding people like at an arm's length. And maybe some of that intelligence signaling that he's doing could also be part of those inferiority feelings. Something else that I'm thinking about with Mark in his formative years, he experienced such an increase in connectedness in the early 90s, into the 2000s, cell phones, internet, social media. And this connectedness that we're kind of realizing now is actually creating a general disconnect in society in real life relationships. So how does this impact his ability to be in relationship and community with others? I think it does have an impact. I think it does lead to some of this, again, this conflict avoidance, the poor communication skills that he just hasn't had to exercise or has chosen to kind of isolate himself. Slide, please. So finally, taking into consideration all of Mark's strata is this idea that he has this kind of like this fuller story, this larger idea to what's going on with Mark. And so my understanding of him as I've worked through this is changed from a client who is emotionally distant, holds himself up on this high logical plane because he's a white man who's never had to experience his feelings. And I've kind of assumed that he's been able to skate through his life and is only in therapy really to satisfy his partner. That's kind of a very stereotypical view of what's going on for him. And now I see him as a person who's been shaped and molded by a brutal society that has forced him to be emotionless, to fit the mold that was created for him. And he has had to bear those consequences. Slide, please. So now we get to kind of like my positionality in this and comparing Mark and myself. And recognizing what I'm bringing into the room. So for Kronos, Mark and I are very similar in age. So we have a very similar Kronos stratum. The thing that I consider as a small difference between the two of us is I've mentioned Roe v. Wade. I didn't say this, but I am on the left side and Mark is on the right. But Roe v. Wade, I think, probably has a larger impact for me and on my Kronos stratum as a woman than it does for Mark. And so I'm considering the ways, like, how does that come into the session with me? What assumptions am I bringing into the session based on that kind of like different experience or having that as a larger experience for me? In regards to social location comparison, I myself am only one removed from a super agent, just based on my gender. And like I said earlier, Mark is a super agent. However, I noticed whenever I was assigned this client and was in the room with him, I did feel intimidated. I did feel that slight difference in him being a man and me being a woman. And I also noticed that I was considering the fact that I was going to be playing out these like very gendered stereotypes of me as this soft and caring woman who's going to help him feel his feelings and we're talk about his feelings and he's not going to want to because he's a man. And so I discussed that with my supervisor and we talked a lot about that and how that made me feel and maybe already coming in with some resentment that I didn't want to play out these stereotypes in session with him. And then when I consider then our individual stratum, the thing that sticks out to me most here is that that difference in education level. And I noticed myself, like, maybe when I'm in the room with him, I'm actually trying to exert some of that power difference that I have, some of that ability, that I do know more than him. And even if I'm experiencing him as intelligent signaling to me, maybe I'm still kind of trying to lean into the power that I have in the room and trying to act as the therapist expert in the room. So that's kind of what we get when we compare both of our aggregate models together, and the ways that I'm noticing kind of the impact of Mark's aggregate model and my aggregate model, and vice versa. Slide, please. So this is the traditional case conceptualization for Mark. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read through all of it, but because I assume most of you have seen these before, but I would just like to highlight that this traditional case conceptualization is really strictly concerning Mark's individual stratum and does not discuss any other influences. Slide, please. So this is the aggregate model case conceptualization, and I will read this quickly. Mark is a 35-year-old white cisgender man who has been socialized and significantly impacted by the US and Western ideals, which prioritize independence and encourage male emotional coldness. He reports concerns about his ability to be supportive and emotionally available to his wife, with whom he lives. His concerns regarding his emotional availability likely stem from his indoctrination to the patriarchal view of men's emotions, which has led him to repress his emotions consistently. He has been habituated into ignoring his emotions to such a degree that he can no longer name his own emotions or name his emotional needs in his relationship. Mark's reported mild to moderate experience of anxiety is possibly from the dissonance between the emotions he feels and suppresses and what the patriarchal society has taught him is acceptable for him to feel and express. His low discomfort tolerance, as well as his conflict avoidance, is likely a consequence of his life experience as a super agent. Then when I consider his treatment recommendations for Mark, I'm thinking about psycho and social education, about chronic disconnection and its impacts on his ability to be in a relationship with others. I think it's appropriate to engage in a developmental model approach to recognize that he is still learning and needs to be helped as he begins to explore and discover his emotions. I think allowing him some opportunities to use manualized treatment so he can feel safe in his tips, tricks, and lists, which was something we talked about in therapy, kind of some of that logic that he wanted, as we continue to push his bounds of experiencing emotions. The primary approach I hope to use as a guide during Mark's treatment is relational cultural therapy. Focusing on his relationships will help elicit the emotional intelligence he hopes to have, and will also provide the care and support he needs in the mutuality that RCT encourages. So I apologize, that was a little quick as I was running through that, but this case conceptualization does incorporate all these different stratum and kind of gives a larger perspective to Mark's concerns. And now I'll hand it over to Miana so she can talk about case 2.
Thank you, Kelly. All right, so I'll be presenting the next case conceptualization just to provide another example of how we can use this model with our clients. So Vivian is a 45-year-old woman from Hong Kong who self-referred herself for psychotherapy in order to better understand and cope with her son's recent diagnosis with ADHD. She states wanting to learn why he has been diagnosed with this and how to adjust her parenting in order to best support him. So some background information about her: she moved from Hong Kong to the US with her son 6 months ago due to the changing socio-political climate and to seek better educational opportunities for her son. Her husband is still residing in Hong Kong for the time being for financial reasons. She reports that adjusting to a different culture and learning how to navigate new systems has been stressful, exhausting, and incredibly lonely. Her son's school has been in constant communication with Vivian about her son's behavioral issues and is repeatedly urging Vivian to seek support for him, which brings up a lot of shame and concern for her. She reports feeling very worried about her son's educational future, especially since that was one of the motives to immigrating to the US in the first place. Regarding her son's recent diagnosis with ADHD, she does not understand what this means about him and doesn't know how to go about seeking support for him, which leaves her feeling very helpless about the situation. So due to the stress and worry she's been experiencing, she has been struggling significantly with sleep, and she's also been reporting a lot of feelings of low mood. When attempting to dive deeper into her emotional experiences, she steers the conversation back to her son and expresses not wanting or needing to talk about herself in therapy. So a summary of her signs and symptoms include stress, helplessness, anxiety, sleep problems, low mood, and loneliness. All right. We can go to the next one. Thank you. So as we go through the aggregate model and fill out the different strata, we can continuously reflect on her signs and symptoms and see how they may relate to different parts of her individual story, her positionality, overarching systems, and political and cultural history. So we'll start off with the individual stratum. So Vivian is married. She's currently middle class. She's unemployed. She's a parent to one child who's recently been diagnosed with ADHD. She immigrated to the US alone with her son. And during the Cultural Revolution, her parents fled China and relocated to Hong Kong. Parts of her individual story provide some context for her symptoms, such as loneliness stemming from moving to the US without her husband, while moving away from her previous community. Her migration story also mirrors her parents, both having left countries of origin due to fear of persecution or a changing socio-political climate. And I wonder how her current symptomology is affected by these intergenerational patterns and how her parents' migration history affects the way she perceives her own migration story. So now we'll go over the social location. So Vivian is a 45-year-old cisgender heterosexual woman with no disabilities. She is of Hong Kong national origin and ethnicity. She's an immigrant to the US. She grew up in a middle-class family and is non-Indigenous in the US. Some questions that came up for me as I examined her social location include how her target ranks and positionality affect how she interacts with systems, such as her son's educational system, the medical system, and the mental health system. I wonder how her acculturation process has been affected by these specific interactions, and how do these both contribute to or intensify her symptoms and signs. And then we'll do the chronostratum. So Vivian was born in 1978. Important historical events that likely had a large impact on her life and worldview include Britain's colonization of Hong Kong in 1842, the Tiananmen Square protests and massacre, the return of Hong Kong to China in 1997, the 2005 protest for democracy, the Hong Kong protest or Umbrella Revolution, the imprisonment of Hong Kong democracy activists, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Important overarching systems to examine include British and Chinese manifestations of patriarchy and white supremacy. Now that we've filled out some pieces of her chronostratum, some important questions that come up that we can reflect on include: what are the cultural effects of shifting to British power and then back to Chinese power? How do the legacies of colonization still show up? How do experiences of Chinese monitoring and democracy conflict affect her and her community? How does her collectivistic cultural background affect her acculturation to the US's individualistic society? And how does her chronostratum impact her social location and individual story? How does the chronostratum influence or even produce some of her signs and symptoms? We'll go to the next slide. So now that we've constructed the whole model, we can contextualize Vivian's signs and symptoms within these different strata and have a better grasp of her worldview and how she moves through the world. I'll do the next slide. So now I'll provide an example of how a therapist can use this model to compare their own aggregate model to their clients. As we go through every stratum, I'll be reflecting on how our differences or similarities will affect our therapeutic relationship and point out aspects of my worldview I'll have to be mindful of. These examples are not an exhaustive list of everything I should reflect on, but just provide some illustrations of what this comparison process may look like. Let's go to the next, or actually no. So starting from the bottom at our individual stories, due to both of us being parents, I have some insight into the common experiences and challenges of being a mother and can use that to aid in our therapeutic relationship and alliance. Despite this, due to my American cultural background, I have to be reflective of my assumptions regarding parenting and motherhood and be mindful about how this may be different for her. It will also be important for me to become aware of my assumptions related to the family structure, familial roles or parental roles, and intentionally interrogate them. So my social location is a 25-year-old cisgender bisexual woman of U.S. national origin and non-Indigenous heritage. I was raised upper middle class and Catholic and have an acquired mental health disability with no developmental disabilities. I am biracial and have Hong Kong, Irish, and German ethnicities. So our shared ethnicity and cultural background will aid in fostering connection, but I have to be mindful not to overestimate how much I understand about her worldview, considering the differences in our national origins. So my multicultural American upbringing is very different than her Hong Kong upbringing, and further exacerbated by our differences in our individual stories and chronos. We do share agency within our socioeconomic statuses, but I have more agency than her in this rank. And because socioeconomic status has such a significant impact on the ability to access resources and navigate systems, this is a privilege of mine that I will have to continually reflect on. And as a second-generation citizen, I've witnessed and heard stories of my mother's immigration experience, like the stress that comes with adjusting to a new country and the difficulties of trying to hold on to your culture while learning about a new one. But seeing and hearing about it secondhand compared to experiencing it firsthand has very different impacts on a person. My national origin also shapes my relationship and perception of America. I may focus so much on my own personal dissatisfaction with the systems and take for granted the privileges that exist by living here when these privileges were central to her reasons for immigration. I also have a familiarity with the American systems and an ease in navigating them. That is just not true for Vivian. So being aware of my privileged identities and addressing these blind spots that stem from my agency should be addressed through research and self-interrogation. And then for the chronos, so regarding our chronostratum, not only did we experience two different time periods, but we experienced those different time periods in completely different places. So although I have understanding into the effects of colonization and impacts of fleeing a country due to fear of persecution through my own familial history, it is again very different experiencing it firsthand. My family's specific experiences are also not universal, so I would have to do a lot more research into how these types of events can impact a person's worldview. And our cultural and our cultural and political backgrounds also have significant impacts on our relational models and sense of self. So although I was raised with collectivistic values, I was also raised within an individualistic society, and this affects how I relate to others, how I conceptualize my sense of self. And doing research on these different values and approaching my conversations with Vivian about this with an open, curious mind will create a therapeutic space where Vivian feels that her values are respected and understood. And without doing this, it is likely that therapy would become another force of assimilation for Vivian. Yeah. All right, so we can move on. So I'll now provide two different case conceptualizations. One is the traditional and colonial version, and then one that uses the aggregate model to contextualize her experiences. As I describe her case in these two different ways, I would like you guys to pay attention to how differently Vivian, her symptomology, treatment recommendations, and diagnosis are presented. So for the traditional case conceptualization, Vivian is a 45-year-old woman from Hong Kong who self-referred herself for psychotherapy in order to better understand and cope with her son's recent diagnosis with ADHD. She states wanting to learn why he has been diagnosed with this and what adjustments she needs to make in order to best parent him. Vivian reports difficulties understanding what his diagnosis means for him. She reports feeling very stressed and helpless trying to navigate new systems to find him proper support. Due to the stress and anxiety, she's been experiencing severe sleep problems. She immigrated from Hong Kong 6 months ago, and adjusting to a new culture has left her feeling very lonely and misunderstood. Vivian appears to be solely focused on her son and resists discussing her own emotional distress. So due to her reported difficulties around two specific stressors, her recent relocation from Hong Kong and her son's diagnosis, I will be diagnosing Vivian with an adjustment disorder with mixed anxiety and depressed mood. Her symptoms of depression, anxiety, and sleep issues are clinically significant and have been impairing her ability to function. Her levels of distress to these adjustments in life are out of proportion to the severity of events. Treatment recommendations include continuing with individual therapy to further process and unpack her adjustment to these two stressors, developing coping strategies to increase her distress tolerance and alleviate the intensity of her symptoms is recommended. Providing psychoeducation about ADHD to develop her understanding of his diagnosis and providing some parenting skills so she can better support her son will be helpful. It is also recommended to discuss the purpose of therapy in that the focus should be on herself rather than her son. Specific therapy methods that may be useful include CBT, acceptance and commitment therapy, and relational cultural therapy. Vivian is motivated to help her son, but lacks insight into her own emotional experiences and purposes of therapy, and therefore may not respond well to treatment. So now we'll do the aggregate model case conceptualization. And again, just notice how different Vivian is presented in these models or in these conceptualizations. So Vivian is a 45-year-old cisgender heterosexual woman with no disabilities. She's of Hong Kong national origin and ethnicity and recently immigrated to the US with her son 6 months ago. Within the last few months, her son has been diagnosed with ADHD. Her symptoms of stress, helplessness, loneliness, anxiety, low mood, and sleep issues related to her immigration and her son's recent diagnosis are understandable responses to such large adjustments in a short amount of time, especially when done without her husband by her side. She's been impacted by multiple large transitions, including leaving her home and community, adjusting to new cultural values and new systems, and facing pressures of assimilation. Becoming exhausted after struggling to find resources to support her son without substantial knowledge on mental health diagnoses or the American mental health care system is completely reasonable and should not be pathologized. Given the context of Vivian's symptomology in the face of large and difficult transitions, I am not diagnosing Vivian with any mental health disorders. The symptoms she is experiencing will be addressed in therapy, but it is important to normalize and validate the experiences and feelings Vivian is reporting. Treatment of Vivian's symptoms need to incorporate and contextualize her experiences within her cultural and political history, her unique positionality, her experiences with systemic oppression, her collectivistic worldview and cultural values, and migration story. The focus of therapy and treatment must be collaborated on, and her own goals and desires must be centered and prioritized. I recommend providing Vivian with resources and referrals to support groups for mothers in her diaspora and helping her develop and find connections to community members in her diaspora. Providing psychoeducation about ADHD and resources to provide her son with treatment and support will be useful. Regarding ways she can personally support her son as a parent, providing information and strategies can be helpful, but it's incredibly important to be mindful of Western assumptions about parenting and mental health when doing this. All right, and then, so as I am wrapping up this client conceptualization, I just want to take notice of how differently we perceive Vivian when we contextualize her experiences and symptoms and how dramatically that can shift treatment, recommendations, and diagnosis. In the traditional case conceptualization, Vivian's symptoms were automatically pathologized and seen as inherently within her rather than as a reflection of the stratum and her surrounding systems. Her desire to focus on her son in therapy and her lack of knowledge on the Western mental health care system were framed as a lack of insight. Her collectivistic worldview and migration story were not taken into account. The aggregate model, on the other hand, took a non-pathologizing view of her adjustment, seeing her symptoms as a normal response to such a difficult transition, and valued her perspectives rather than making assumptions rooted in Western superiority. So as demonstrated in the traditional case conceptualization, without engaging in this sort of self-reflection, we risk wrongly pathologizing our clients and minimizing the effects our overarching systems have on both our clients and ourselves. As exhibited, this model allows clinicians to intentionally deconstruct the lenses we use to perceive our clients. These assumptions, blind spots, and aspects of power and privilege already show up in the therapeutic room, and purposefully naming them and addressing them is a part of providing ethical and effective care.
All right. Thank you very much to all three of you, to Jude and Kelly and Miana, for presenting us with this model and also for demonstrating how it can be applied so well and effectively to our clients and to viewing them from decolonial and social justice lens. I'm going to speak now just briefly and move through these last few slides quickly so that we have a few moments for Q&A time at the end. But I wanted to speak about the expectations of ourselves as clinicians using a model such as this one. What do we expect from ourselves as we engage with this kind of work and perceiving our clients and conceptualizing them in this way? And one of the first and most important pieces in this is self-awareness. We believe and foster the belief that our own understanding of ourselves is crucial to doing this work. As you can see through our framing of both the clinician and the client, we're bringing this level of self-awareness into play. We want to recognize our privilege and where it exists and how we take this into the room with us, how this intersects with our power as therapists and clinicians in these environments. We feel it's very necessary to confront our internalized racism and our inherent biases and judgments. And as Kelly and Miana demonstrated, being able to recognize where our biases lie, what we have internalized, and those expectations we take into the room make a difference in our understanding of our clients as well as ourselves. We strive and expect ourselves to pursue lifelong, ever-deepening critical consciousness. We want to see and understand our clients as individuals and do this from a way that takes into account an understanding of the systemic issues and bring more consciousness to ourselves. We seek to shake off the disconsciousness being those things that are much like the water we swim in or the air that we breathe. It is pervasive, and it is the colonial mindset that is pervasive for us and creates a sense of disconsciousness. We are often unaware of our privilege and how it benefits us and how we move through the world. So we seek to shake this off and to shake off the colonial mindset that is permeating our field and permeating us from living and being born and living in through this culture that we all are part of. We wish to gaze through a developmental and compassionate lens, both with our clients, but also with our fellow colleagues. We want a developmental perspective that understands that people are at different places in their journeys through both their individual, their social location, and even through that developmental aspect of the Cronus piece of the model. We also want to bring a compassionate lens to our work with others, and to understand that growth happens and that observing and witnessing that growth has a great deal of power. We also seek to examine sociopolitical realities. We don't want to live, as we see from exploring Kronos, in a world that does not take into account the larger picture. Along with this, we feel a constant need to identify structural repression. We want to face the realities of the lived experiences of target ranks, including the ongoing reality of violence against BIPOC individuals. And through this, we want to move beyond historical amnesia that says we don't recognize the history and the weight that is placed on all of us in our culture from this historical amnesia. We have a lot of expectations for our students, and this is a model, as Kelly and Miana demonstrated, that they're taught in their first year in our program through the classes that Jude and I co-teach on social justice and cultural humility. And not only through this exposure to the aggregate model, but also through our entire program and our tremendous social justice focus, we have very high expectations of our students. And it's very important to us that we acknowledge these to the students here present with us in the audience, as well as our co-presenters, but also understanding that these expectations are real and that we place an incredibly high demand on our students in asking them to be social justice clinicians. Along this line, all of the things that I just noticed, we ask of our students. So it is a matter of all this and all that too. And what I mean by this is that we ask them everything I just said that we ask of ourselves: self-awareness, sociopolitical realizations and realities. And we ask our students to look at themselves and to look at their social location and their time and place and developmental trajectories. At the same time, we are asking them to learn the well-established, empirically validated psychological models that exist for clinical psychologists. As an APA-approved program, it's incredibly necessary for us to prepare our students according to the competencies that the quite colonial APA recommends. We believe that our status as an APA program offers our students the most opportunity in their career, and so we're very dedicated to providing this, but it also means that we must juggle constantly the need for APA competency in our students as well as a social justice competency. So we're asking them to hold both of these things, and holding these dichotomies can be incredibly challenging. And we recognize these challenges, and we believe very much that our students can live up to these. We ask our students, we're asking you to think critically about our field as well as the world around you, and to seek new levels of critical consciousness throughout their careers as clinical psychologists. And finally, we expect our students and hope and wish that they find and connect with other clinicians who are focused on social justice issues. So it's a great deal to ask. Along this line, we also have some questions for you as our colleagues who are in the audience today and perhaps listening to a recording at some point in time. We want to ask you some of these questions. First of all, to encourage you to examine your pedagogy and think about how and what you are teaching. This is a major theme for the conference symposium, and we're excited to be pushing and challenging you to think about what you're teaching. And along with that, to think about who are these new psychologists or therapists or educators or leaders that you as a professor, as an instructor, as an educator, how are you helping to create these new psychologists, these new leaders out in our world? Who are they and who are they going to be? We ask you to bring self-awareness into your work. How do you hold privilege as a professor in the room? What do you take in with you? Where is your power? How do you use that power in the classroom and in all aspects of your teaching? We ask you to think in terms of structural oppression. This is a heavy, weighty topic, but as Dr. Tima told us this morning, we also bring joy into this work. We want you to consider, what are the realities of your students' lives? What are the realities of students of color in your university, in your classrooms, in your programs? And what about students holding any other target ranks? What is the reality of that structural oppression they're confronted with? And finally, we challenge you to confront the historical amnesia of our field, to take a look at the realities of history as they have molded and shaped each of us in our worlds, in our work, in how we move through our lives. So these are challenging questions, and we hope you'll consider some of these as you perhaps reflect later on what you've learned today. Oh, I missed one of my own questions. Where is the field exploited, harmed, and taken advantage of those in their target ranks? So this is part of that historical amnesia look. We do recognize the risks that are inherent in utilizing a model like this, the risks that we are asking our students to take, that we are asking of you, of our colleagues, and those risks that we face. And we want to stress that by talking about this, by presenting these ideas, by researching, building, developing models, training clinicians, we're asking you all to take a leap of faith and take a leap that we can together create a better world, that we can create a better system, that psychology as a field has a future that will look different than its colonial past. So we're asking you to take this leap of faith and this leap of hope. Oh, timer went off. I'm supposed to be stopping. I'm almost there. So the leap of hope says that we have that hope, that we recognize the joy that Dr. Tima talked about this morning, that we believe that we can do better, that our students can move beyond where we were trained as clinicians to a new place and a new social justice focus. We recognize the risk of moving outside of best practices. What happens when we ask our students to not only create a traditional case conceptualization, as Kelly and Miana demonstrated, but we ask them to move beyond and think differently and go beyond a best practice of a medical model and into a different place. This has risks in it. These are risks to reputation and livelihood, and we recognize that. We ask you to step outside, and it is a risk that we understand and live through ourselves. In conclusion, what we've done today is we've offered you a new conceptualization of clients, but of thinking about both diagnosis and treatment, understanding clients, how we work with them. We're asking you to transcend the typical individualism of our field to look at a collective worldview through our chronos, through social location, transcending these pieces. And we're questioning the veracity of objective scientific medical model of doing clinical work. We're challenging you to recognize your privilege and that of others, to take a developmental approach in connecting with others, and to confront your colonial mindset by lifting the veil of disconsciousness. We hope that you bring awareness to the complexities of your interactions with others. And we encourage you and ask you to look to the future. We are living in a changing world. The global and national political systems are struggling for supremacy yet again. Who will be the psychologists and therapists of the future that are confronting and working with people going forward? So that concludes. We'd like to move into a question and answer session. I've popped up on the image here a QR code. This QR code, if you take your camera phone and highlight this, it will take you to our DSPY website that you can read more about our writings and our work. So I'll leave that up there, but we would like to open it up for question and answer time. As long as I have my slides up, I can't see the chat. So I'm going to let either.
I'm right here. I'm with you, Dr. Kennedy. So if anybody wants to drop questions in the chat or the question and answer thing, I will ask them of Dr. Kennedy. Thank you.
And ask them of everyone, please.
Yeah, of course. Yes. Thank you.
I am happy to let others answer questions. So, and we do want to thank you all for coming and joining us today. I do recognize we've only got about 4 or 5 minutes to ask questions. So anything that you would like to ask us about, please feel free.
So Adam was wondering, how do I interact my internalized depression? I guess maybe how do I interact with my internalized depression and colonization?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody want to take a shot at that?
Kelly, Miana, you want to try? Great. Good job, Kelly. Yeah.
I feel like this is like a difficult topic to speak kind of like offhand about, but I think something that I have done, obviously coming from my position as a white woman, is seeking out texts that are discussing like the impacts of colonization. I think like Dr. Kennedy mentioned, like if you aren't aware of them, like they kind of just like surround us and we're just like swimming in them. There's a new book out, Decolonizing Psychology. I'm blanking on the author's name, but I think it talks a lot about the things that we don't realize and that are inherently colonial. And so I think in my time in DSPY, as well as being at Antioch and kind of getting exposed to these things, reading the research that's out there, the literature, and kind of outside of that scholarly realm too, just like what are the impacts of decoloniality and just understanding that we really do swim in it in everything that we do. I'm not sure if that's like the best response, but that's what I have done, and including some of that oppression, just understanding the ways that impacts you kind of sometimes helps me to see other people's explanations of how they have come to terms with that.
Yeah, and I think just adding on to that, I do agree that like the awareness piece is one of those just like foundational things that help you begin to really interact and understand internalized oppression and colonization. And I think one of the things that was in the last slides is also really helpful is finding your group of social justice clinicians or those that you feel comfortable discussing these types of topics with, and whether that's just like consulting or just having conversations. Yeah, finding solidarity and working through that with others can be really useful, and just kind of deconstructing your own perspective and understanding how others are also working through that.
Great. Thank you both. And I'm just going to ask Kelly, if you were talking about Jennifer Mullen's book about decolonizing therapy, maybe. Yeah. So I'll throw that in the chat for anybody who's interested. And we have
Oh, also, I think, Dr. Everts, I think, Holly, were you also talking about the Decolonizing Psychology by Lillian Gomez Diaz as one of the editors?
okay.
Both of them.
Book, absolutely. I've been hearing a lot about actually both of those, but recently about Jennifer, so that's great. Both good options. How does the aggregate model interface with the POTT model?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap. I think that the aggregate model and emerging models in the last 5 to 10 years do have a lot of overlap. Melissa and I have completed a manuscript that's in submission now. We have a section in that article all about kind of comparisons between the aggregate model and other models and what they have in common, kind of a compare contrast section. So hopefully that'll come out soon, and I would encourage folks to take a look at that.
That's great.
Also, just to add to that, I think the person of the therapist model, and I've not been trained in that model, so I'm just kind of going off just very general understanding of it. I think that we're bringing in social location in a little bit different way, as well as some Chronos pieces that may not be considered. So, but I do think there's a lot of overlap, and we nod to the wide array of other people who are also trying to expand conceptualization and understanding as we go forward. So thank you for questions. And I know we're 1 minute over time, but I don't know if there's more to wrap up, Kate, if you have a way
That's great. I do have a little bit of a spiel to give you. Also, it's the Lillian Gomez Diaz book is actually called Decolonial Psychology. So that was part of what was happening there. I'll put that in the chat so that you have that.
Thank you.
And we are going to have a half-hour break now, everybody, and then we will have Jude Bergkamp's and Eva Baker's Understanding the BIPOC Faculty Burden Review and Implications, or you can go to Tori Grace Nichols' Queer Cultural Organizing in the U.S. South. And thank you again to all 4 of you for presenting today. This was really informative and exemplary. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for having us. We really enjoyed being here. Have a good day. We'll see you all later. We have more to come. Bye-bye.